People keep asking me if I lost it. They want to know if I put my fist through a wall, if I screamed, if I said things I couldn't take back. And every time I tell them the truth that I didn't do any of those things, they look at me like I'm the strange one. Maybe I am. But here's what I've learned in 63 years of living. The quieter I get, the more dangerous the situation actually is. My wife figured that out about me sometime around year 4 of our marriage. She told me once that when I go silent, she knows something real is happening. Not surface level frustration. Not the kind of thing that blows over by dinner. Something that cuts all the way down. That Tuesday in October, I was the quietest I have ever been in my life. I want to tell you what happened from the beginning, because if I just give you the headline, you'll think you understand it. You won't. The headline doesn't tell you about the 31 years my wife and I spent building something together, or the way I watched her hold our daughter through every stumble she ever took, or the way my chest still tightens when I think about what I walked through that front door to find. So let me start at the beginning. My name is not important. What matters is that I am a husband, a father, and a man who made exactly one mistake over the last several years. And that mistake was confusing love with permission. My wife's name is Evelyn. We met when I was 32 and she was 29, at a company picnic of all places, the kind of event everyone dreads and nobody admits they actually enjoy. She was laughing at something her coworker said, and I remember thinking that I had never heard a laugh quite like that. Unguarded, completely unself-conscious. I introduced myself 10 minutes later and spent the next 45 minutes pretending I wasn't completely disarmed by her. We married 2 years after that. Our daughter Natalie came along 4 years into the marriage. I need to say something about Natalie, because what I'm about to tell you isn't a story about a bad person. It's a story about a person who made bad choices, and those are different things, even if the consequences sometimes look the same. Natalie was a bright kid, curious, warm, funny in a dry way that she got from her mother. She was also, if I'm honest, a child who never experienced real resistance. Evelyn and I gave her everything we had, and looking back, I think we also inadvertently gave her the impression that everything in life would bend toward her the way we did. That's not her fault entirely. That's on us. She met her husband. I'll call him her husband, because I cannot bring myself to use a more affectionate term for him anymore, at 26. His name is Conrad. Conrad came from money, which might sound like I'm building toward a story about class resentment, but that's not it. I have nothing against people who come from money. I have everything against people who treat other people as stepping stones. Conrad's family, his father Alton and his mother, Sylvia, operated the way certain families do when they believe the world owes them continued access to comfort. They were pleasant enough on the surface, the kind of pleasant that always felt like it was maintaining something rather than expressing something. Evelyn picked up on it before I did. She told me, early on, that Sylvia smiled with her mouth closed, and I laughed it off, and I wish to God I hadn't. Natalie and Conrad married 3 years after they started dating. By that point, Evelyn and I had gotten comfortable in our retirement. I'd worked in commercial real estate for most of my career, built up a solid portfolio, made some decisions over the decades that compounded well. We weren't wealthy in the way that makes the news, but we were secure, and we had worked for every bit of it. When Natalie and Conrad got married, I helped. That's what you do. I co-signed on their first home loan when Conrad's credit history came up short. I added Natalie as an authorized user on one of my credit accounts for emergencies, and somehow, over about 4 years, the emergencies became a lifestyle. I'm not talking about the occasional tank of gas. I'm talking about furniture, vacations, a kitchen renovation. I saw the statements. I said nothing, because Natalie was my daughter, and I told myself that family helps family, and she would find her footing. Evelyn was quieter about her concerns than I was about mine, which is saying something. But I noticed the way she'd look at the statements sometimes. I noticed the way she'd stop herself mid-sentence when I came into the room, like she'd decided whatever she'd been about to say wasn't worth the fight. I should have had the conversation sooner. I know that now. About 8 months before everything fell apart, I started noticing a shift. Conrad began asking questions about our property, specifically about a piece of land about 2 hours outside the city that Evelyn and I had owned for over 20 years. Originally, we'd bought it with vague ideas about building a second home someday, retiring close to the water. We never built. We kept paying the taxes, kept the property clean, and held on to it because we liked knowing it was there. Sentimental, maybe, but ours. Conrad's questions started casual. Just curious, he said. Just wondering what our plans were. He mentioned a developer he knew who was looking at that region. He mentioned what land was going for out there these days. I answered politely. I didn't tell him that something about the question sat wrong with me. I mentioned it to Evelyn that night, and she said very quietly, I noticed that too. We let it go. I flew out to Denver in early October for a 4-day meeting with a group of investors I'd been consulting for. Routine work. I do some part-time consulting now, nothing demanding, just enough to stay useful. I told Evelyn on Monday morning, kissed her at the door, said I'd be back Friday. I came back Thursday. The meetings finished early, the flights aligned, and I genuinely thought, that walking through the door a day early would make her happy. I almost texted her from the airport. I didn't, because I wanted to see her face. I have replayed that decision 10,000 times since then. Every time I'm grateful I didn't send that text. Because if I had, what I needed to see might have been hidden before I ever got there. I pulled into the driveway at just past 2 in the afternoon. The house looked normal. Natalie's car was in the driveway, which wasn't unusual. She came by a few times a week, usually to visit her mother. There was a second car I didn't recognize parked at the curb. Newer model, out-of-state plates. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open. She was on the living room floor. Evelyn was on the living room floor, her back against the base of the couch, and there was blood. Not a small amount of blood, on the carpet near her left hand, and on the fabric of the couch cushion near her head. And she was crying, not loud. Not the kind of crying that fills a room. The quiet, exhausted kind that happens when someone has been at it for a while and no one has come. My bag hit the floor. I don't remember putting it down. I crossed the room and I was on my knees in front of her before I had a single coherent thought, and I had my hands on her face and I was saying her name and she looked at me like she couldn't quite believe I was real. I fell, she said. Her voice was hoarse. I couldn't get up. Her left wrist was swollen badly, angled wrong. The blood was from a gash on her forearm where she'd caught the edge of the coffee table going down. She'd been on that floor for, I found out later, somewhere close to 2 hours. From the back of the house, from the direction of the kitchen, I could hear voices. Laughter. I called 911 before I did anything else. I stayed on the floor with Evelyn, holding her right hand, keeping my voice level so she wouldn't hear the thing that was happening inside me. The dispatcher told me to keep her still, and that a unit would be there within 8 minutes. I said thank you. I stayed on my knees on that carpet, and I kept my eyes on my wife, and I breathed. 8 minutes that felt like something I don't have a word for. The paramedics came through the front door, 2 of them, professional and quick. They moved past the living room entryway. They couldn't have missed what they saw on their way through. They got to work, and I stepped back and let them work. And then I walked toward the kitchen. Natalie, Conrad, and his parents, Alton and Sylvia, were seated around the kitchen table. There were coffee cups, there were papers spread across the table. Conrad was mid-sentence when I appeared in the doorway, and the sentence stopped. The room went very still. I looked at all 4 of them. I looked at the papers on the table. I looked at my daughter, whose face had gone the color of old chalk. Dad, she said. You weren't supposed to be back until... I know, I said. I turned to look back down the hallway, where I could hear the paramedics working, where my wife of 31 years was on the floor she had been on for 2 hours. Then I looked back at them. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters. Not because I was performing composure, but because the anger I felt in that moment was not the kind that needs volume. It was the kind that goes very cold and very still, like something that has been compressed so tightly it no longer needs to move to exert force. Is there a reason, I said, that you are sitting at this table? Nobody answered. Your mother, I said to my daughter, has been on the floor in the living room for approximately 2 hours. There are paramedics with her right now. I paused. Was anyone aware of this? The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know before anyone spoke. Natalie said softly. We heard her fall. Conrad said she probably just needed a minute. We thought. You thought, I repeated. Conrad cleared his throat. He started to say something about how Evelyn had seemed fine earlier, how she'd walked through the kitchen herself just a while before, how they didn't want to make a big deal out of nothing. I held up one hand, and he stopped. I looked at the papers on the table. I recognized the format. I had signed enough documents over my career to know what a property transfer agreement looks like. I stepped closer and I looked at the top of the first page, and there was our names, mine and Evelyn's, printed at the top, and below that the legal description of our land. I looked at Alton. Whose idea was this? I asked. Alton met my eyes without flinching, which told me he'd been expecting this conversation at some point. Just not today, just not like this. He said it was just an exploratory conversation. He said the developer opportunity was real, that the land was sitting unused, that we could see real money from a sale, and that he'd simply thought it made sense to get the paperwork in order in advance. In advance, I said. While you were traveling, he said, we thought Natalie could. I need you to stop talking, I said. He stopped. I looked at Sylvia, who had not said a word since I walked in. She was looking at the table. I want you out of my house, I said to Alton and Sylvia. Right now, both of you, leave the papers. Alton began to stand and began to say something about how there was no need to be. I didn't ask for your assessment of what's needed, I said. I asked you to leave. They left. I watched them go through the front door, past the paramedics who were now guiding Evelyn onto a stretcher in the living room. Alton and Sylvia didn't look at her on their way out. Stood in the kitchen doorway with my daughter and her husband. Conrad, I said, step outside. I'll speak with my daughter alone. He looked at Natalie. She gave him a small nod, and he walked out through the back door. I heard it close behind him. I sat down across from my daughter. For a moment I just looked at her. She was 34 years old. She had her mother's eyes. She was looking at her hands. Tell me what I walked into, I said. She told me. It took about 15 minutes, and she cried through parts of it, and I let her cry without filling the silence because I needed to hear all of it, what I learned. Alton had been pushing for months, through Conrad, who had been pushing Natalie. The pitch was that our land had appreciated significantly, that a developer Alton knew was prepared to offer well above market, that the deal made financial sense, and that if we were going to sell eventually anyway, why not now? Conrad had suggested that with Evelyn's health concerns, she'd been managing high blood pressure for several years. It might make sense to move assets while things were straightforward. Natalie said she had raised concerns. She said she'd told Conrad she didn't feel right doing any of this while I was out of town. She said she'd tried to delay. I believed parts of that. I believed she had discomfort. I did not believe the discomfort had been strong enough because she had been sitting at that table and her mother had been on the floor. Did you know she'd fallen? I asked. Long pause. We heard it, she said. Conrad said she was probably getting up on her own. He said if it was serious, she'd call out. She was alone in the living room, I said. She had been alone in the living room for 2 hours. Her wrist is broken. She bled on the carpet. My daughter looked at me then, and the expression on her face was not defiance and it was not excuse-making. It was shame, the real kind, the kind that knows it's earned. And I won't pretend that didn't matter to me, because it did. But it didn't change what I had to do. I need you to understand something, I said. What happened today, your mother on that floor, that is not something that gets talked through and set aside. You understand that? She nodded. I'm going to the hospital now, I said. You're not coming. I stood up and walked to the living room. Evelyn was on the stretcher, and one of the paramedics was explaining to me what they'd assessed. Suspected wrist fracture, laceration, blood pressure elevated but manageable. I said I'd follow to the hospital. She reached her right hand toward me, and I took it, and I walked beside the stretcher out to the driveway, and I told her I was right behind her, and I told her she was okay, and I meant both things as completely as I have ever meant anything. At the hospital, while Evelyn was being evaluated, I sat in a waiting room chair, and I made some calls. The first call was to my attorney. I told him what I'd found on the table. Property transfer paperwork for the land, prepared without my knowledge or signature, apparently intended to be signed by Evelyn in my absence. I asked him what that looked like legally. He used a phrase I expected, attempted fraud. He told me to preserve everything, touch nothing, let the papers stay where they were. The second call was to my financial advisor. I told him to remove Natalie as an authorized user on my credit account, effective immediately. He said he'd process it by end of day. The third call was to the bank, to confirm the process for removing Natalie from any accounts where she had access. The fourth call was the one that hurt the most, if I'm being honest with myself. Over the years, I had helped Conrad build his professional network in a real way. I'd introduced him to 3 people who had become meaningful clients of his. A former colleague of mine who ran a mid-sized logistics company, and 2 other men I'd known for years who had trusted my judgment enough to meet Conrad because I asked them to. Conrad had built significant work through those relationships. Real money. The kind of foundation a career gets built on. I called each of those three men. I did not dramatize what I told them. I said there had been a serious breach of trust in my family involving my son-in-law, that I could no longer stand behind the relationship I had brokered, and that I felt I owed them the transparency to tell them that directly before they heard anything else. Each of them thanked me. Each of them said they understood. I sat with the phone in my lap after the last call and stared at the tile floor of the waiting room. I want to be honest about what that felt like. It did not feel satisfying. It did not feel like justice. It felt like removing a piece of something that could not be put back. I did it because it was the right thing to do, not to punish Conrad, though that was a consequence, but because those men deserved to know where things stood. Evelyn's wrist was fractured in 2 places. The laceration on her forearm required 8 stitches. Her blood pressure had spiked significantly, likely from the stress and pain of being on that floor for as long as she was. The doctor who treated her was measured and professional, and he told me that had she been found later, the blood pressure situation could have been considerably worse. He said it with the practiced calm of someone who gives difficult context regularly. I thanked him and sat with her while she rested. She asked me, once, what had been happening in the kitchen. I told her. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I knew something felt wrong when they got here. I asked her what she meant. Sylvia brought coffee, she said. She was very warm, very helpful. And I thought, why is Sylvia being warm? She looked at the ceiling. And then I stood up to go get the phone because I was going to call you. And everything went sideways. She had been trying to call me when she fell. I held her hand. I didn't say anything. I just held her hand. 3 days later, after Evelyn was home and resting, and the prescriptions were sorted, and the follow-up appointments were scheduled, I sat down with Natalie. I asked Conrad to be present. I wanted him to hear it directly. I told them both, calmly, without theater, what I had done. The credit account, the bank accounts, the 3 professional relationships. I told them that I had spoken with my attorney, and that depending on how things developed with the paperwork I had found on my table, there might be legal considerations down the road. Conrad sat very still. His face was the face of a man doing rapid calculations. Natalie was crying before I finished. When I was done, I looked at my daughter and I said, I love you. That has not changed and it will not change. But love is not the same thing as access. And the things I've given you over the years, I gave them because I thought they were building something. What I found out last Thursday is that they were being used for something else entirely. She said through tears, I didn't want any of this. I know, I said. But you sat at that table. I let that sit for a moment. Your mother's wrist is going to take 4 months to heal properly. 4 months. She is 61 years old, and she has a cast on her arm, and she is managing her blood pressure every day. That is the consequence of what happened in my house while I was in Denver. I need you to hold that. I stood up. I'm not closing the door on you, I said to my daughter. But I am not opening it wider until I see something change. Not words. Something that takes time. Conrad started to speak, about his side of it I assume, about what he intended or didn't intend, and I turned to look at him with the same stillness I'd had in that kitchen, and he went quiet again. You should talk to a lawyer, I told him plainly. Not because I've decided what I'm going to do, but because you should understand your position clearly. They left. I went back to the bedroom, where Evelyn was resting with her arm elevated on 2 pillows. I sat in the chair beside the bed. Outside the window, the afternoon light was doing the thing it does in October, going golden long across the yard, the way it only does for a few weeks before the gray sets in. She looked at me. Was it bad? She asked. It was necessary, I said. She nodded slowly. Then she held out her right hand, the one without the cast, and I leaned forward and took it. That night, after she'd fallen asleep, I sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of coffee that went cold before I touched it, and I thought about the years. The credit card statements I'd let slide. The questions about the land I'd answered politely and let go. The 100 small moments where I could have drawn a line and chose instead to keep the peace. I thought about what it cost to keep the peace. I thought about the carpet in the living room and the 2-hour window when my wife was on that floor and nobody went to check. The land is still ours. It will stay ours. My attorney is handling the rest, and I will let the law work at its own pace. Evelyn is home, and she is healing, and in the evening she sits in her chair by the window and reads, And sometimes she catches me watching her, and she rolls her eyes a little and goes back to her book. I don't tell her that I look over every 15 minutes or so just to confirm she's there. I think she knows. There are people who will read this and say I should have done more. There are people who will say I should have done less. There are people who will tell me that family is family and that the door should be left wide open regardless. Maybe they're right and I'm wrong. I've been wrong before. I'll be wrong again. But I know what I walked through that front door to find, and I know that the man who walked out of that hospital 3 days later was not going to let it pass without making sure that something, somewhere, actually changed. My wife's laugh is the same, still unguarded, still completely unself-conscious. That is the only thing I needed to be true, and it still is.